Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much, Kent. Like many of the other presenters, I feel I've over-prepared, so I will try not to rush through. I'm used to trying to entertain 17, 18-year-olds for an hour and a half, so I'm sure that you will be more riveted, but at the same time, I'm going to feel like I need to rush more. I don't have a particular cultish experience, though. As a lifelong evangelical Christian, I certainly have brushed the doors of legalism and charismatic movements to the point where I sometimes felt uncomfortable. And as I mentioned to Pastor Ken last night, I'll bring my golf clubs to family camp every now and then. I need to get a detox. But my cultish experience, if you wish, is I spent 20 years in what I call the Church of Oliver Stone. So conspiracy theories, conspiracism, as I call it, I would say played a very deep trick on my own insecurities, my desire for certainty. Despite having a religious faith, I was attracted to political solutions to what I saw were major problems in the world. So it took a while for me to kind of come out of that rabbit hole and get a better, wider perspective of that. I'll say a little bit more about myself in a few minutes. First of all, this picture speaks 1,000 words. You're not seeing the whole thing there. Of course, it's about January 6, 2021. And there we see a noose right in front of Congress. And I don't know if the title of my talk is a bit cryptic, but the high cabal is a term that many conspiracy theorists will use to describe whatever happens over there, the deep state, the men who killed Kennedy, the patriarchy, whatever it is, some group of schemers with cigars and bourbon in a back room making decisions over your life. That's not to say these groups don't exist, but they tend to not be what we imagine them to be. On the other hand, people who believe in these conspiracy theories have a tendency to want to fight fire with fire and start imitating the type of group that they think is controlling the world, and are willing to sometimes visit violence, though usually it's verbal violence or cancellation or whatnot, in order to try to bring justice to the world. I do believe that conspiracism and cultishness are interlocking phenomena. They're not exactly the same thing, but they sometimes are indecipherable, as in Jonestown or Waco and the Koreshites. It's really hard to tell apart what's cultish and what's conspiracist. So I've come to believe that they're both part of a manifestation of something larger. And I met a theory that really appealed to me, though I'm not a Catholic. René Girard, who is a devout Catholic, I think put his finger on something that helps to explain not just human nature, in a way that is not kind of cryptic. He doesn't use words like original sin, but it does talk a little bit about our desire to belong to a group, and by doing so, needing an enemy to be able to define who we are or who we want to be. So René Girard's theory, I found, was much more significant and useful to understand conspiracism and cultishness than, say, the theories of Marx or Foucault, which tend to also be conspiracists. They tend to also see that there are these power elites that are controlling us. So the one warning I want to give today is I'm not trying to blame the victim. I'm not trying to say that people who join certain groups are completely responsible for their fate. But what I wanted to understand, because conspiracism does not generally have those central gurus who control individuals, there's a phenomenon of self-deception that leads people to want to belong to a community of like-minded individuals. And sometimes the cult, as I said, is conspiracist. Sometimes they're not, but quite often they use conspiracy theories as part of the epistemology, the basic teachings, to set a separation between themselves and the rest of the world. So allow me to move on. I'll try not to speak too quickly. A little bit about myself. I teach humanities in a junior college in Montreal. It's not a research facility, but I like to do a lot of research. If I could find a way to monetize it, you can bet that I would be marking a lot fewer essays. So I'm a historian by profession, but since I teach a lot of philosophy, I've come to talk about myself as a philosophical historian. I've recently published a book called Thinking Critically About the Kennedy Assassination. Like people leaving cults, this was my cult leaving. In 2011, I actually read the Warren Commission report on the assassination of Kennedy, and I realized that a lot of what I was told was in there was not in there, because people like Oliver Stone and so on had to actually lie, manipulate information to get you to believe in what they want you to believe. So in essence, it's a critical thinking handbook, but it helps students, it helps guide them through the various steps of critical thinking by looking at this, what I call the mother of all conspiracies, or you know, the greatest cold case. I don't think it's a cold case, but many conspiracists do. By the way, I believe Lee Oswald did it alone. I also have a podcast since 2000. It was a little bit hard to meet people on the street during COVID, though it's kind of a variety show. Don't get fooled by the aliens. We don't really talk about UFOs that much. Eventually I might. But I like to look at conspiracy phenomena, talking to various experts. I have actually quoted you, Stephen, although you may never have heard of me until this weekend. I did a series on cults. And if you go, you will find interviews with Mike Kropfeld, Tony Ortega on Scientology, Fielding McGee on Jonestown. And then actually, I quoted you when we talked about QAnon, whether it's a cult or not a cult. And Jonathan Kay from Quillette spoke about his book on 9/11 truthers. So there's a lot there about cultishness, even though it's mainly on conspiracy theories. And just recently, I joined a foundation in Canada called the Aristotle Foundation. Their purpose is to try to rehabilitate public discourse from the extremes of populism and cancel culture. So I would say it's a classical liberal / libertarian / what we call progressive conservative in Canada think tank. It's a podcast, and I think that's why they reached out to me. So anyways, enough about me. Let's talk about scapegoating. Scapegoating is the very root of Girard's theory, though it's usually called mimetic violence. And I believe it's at the root of conspiracism, and you see it in a lot of cultish groups as well. I'm a little bit, okay, yeah, so these were the questions that I set out more or less to answer. I was writing this essay. I will confess that I also tried to piggyback also on another conference that I was at Harvard 2 months ago. So my paper, which the reason it's probably far too long, is I was trying to please 2 different groups at the same time. So what I want to focus on today is largely to look at the bottom-up structure of conspiracism. The guru doesn't come and manipulate people. People are drawn towards an idea, a hunt for truth, and that way they become not infantilized like in a where the father figure does everything for them. They become more like tantrumy teenagers, in which everybody becomes their own, missionary apostle of truth, out trying to convert others to the cause. I would say conspiracism is more product, while cultism. Cults tend to be more Catholic in the sense that they're more top down, and conspiracists tend to have this more kind of evangelical structure to them. So that's not me, but for 20 years, I would say, a member of the JFK buff community. It's a community that I could join through my computer, thanks to the internet. Oliver Stone's 1991 film, JFK played a very important role for people of my generation, Generation X. Although I've met many older people, for them it was Geraldo Rivera in 1975 when the Zapruder film was first shot. And by repeating back into the left, back into the left, back into the left, you see what you want to see, and you become convinced that there must have been a shot from the front. And that's kind of the aha experience that leads many people down this, decades-long rabbit hole of trying to figure out who and why, who killed Kennedy and why. A few comments here. Actually, no, I wanted to read my introduction here. Sorry. I will argue in this presentation that conspiracism is a cultish phenomenon that appeals especially to the powerless and those afraid of losing power, and that, like many high-control religious sects or cults, are epistemically flawed and psychologically harmful. in their search for purpose, acceptance, fraternity, and self-esteem. In doing so, I will consider how René Girard's scapegoating theory can help us understand that conspiracism is not a product of mental illness or of political radicalism per se, although they sometimes play a role, nor is it the particular problem of any specific social class, political group, culture, race, gender, or sex. There is a tendency to think that conspiracism is a conservative thing, particularly in the age of Trump, but studying the 1960s and 70s, you see that left-wing conspiracism was just as strong or stronger back then. I believe conspiracism is a byproduct of a much larger existential problem, rooted in human nature, produced by our deep need for self-affirmation, social belonging, and an uplifting historical narrative that invites us to collectively pass blame on an arbitrary victim in order to stake the moral high ground in our personal life story. There's a lot of information there. I want to be able to read that. So let's talk a little bit about René Girard. Sorry, well, let me define the term scapegoat for you. I think I have it written down here. To scapegoat is to arbitrarily ascribe blame to a person or group, irrespective of any known proof of their guilt, based on how much of a threat they are perceived to be, not what they actually did. Right? When you look at that picture that I showed you earlier, it's not what actually goes on in Congress. It's what the people gathered in front are thinking is going on in Congress or in the basement or in some pizzeria across the town, right? There's very much an element of myth making and projection involved in trying to understand what the enemy, so-called, is doing. In so doing, the scapegoating mechanism serves a dual purpose. A, it allows the ones passing blame, us, the satisfaction of putting a face on the source of some ill-defined evil that threatens our way of life. While B, it lets us abdicate responsibility, individual or collective, for the crisis at hand and its causes. I'm intentionally using the first person here because I think it's easy to see when other people are behaving this way. Sometimes it's hard to realize that we're doing it as well. In many examples of scapegoating in both mythology and history, acts of group violence or ostracism against an individual or minority are often presented by those who perpetrate them as a necessary abuse of justice in the pursuit of a greater good. So if you think people are conspiring against you, you're more likely to believe that it's okay for you to conspire against them, right? The narcissist personality believes that they are a victim of some sort, and therefore they have the right to lie, to conceal, etc. René Girard's argument invites us to view conspiracism as a contemporary manifestation of mob violence, akin to ancient public stonings, medieval witch hunts, and racist lynchings. I don't know if you're familiar with this painting, Domenichino, I think that's how you pronounce it. Did this very interesting painting, right? We often think of the story of Adam and Eve. I'm not preaching, you need to believe it or not, but it's a very powerful myth. And by myth, a story is accepted as historical, not because there's any evidence that it actually happened, but because it actually explains life. It actually offers kind of for explaining the world, why people suffer, etc. My microphone too low? It's better now? Yes. Okay. I have a tendency to shout. Maybe that's why I put it louder. Hello. Okay. So what's interesting about this painting, and I don't know if Girard ever talked about it, but you'll notice this is not the first sin. This is not the disobedience, the woman eating the fruit and passing it to her husband. It's the second sin, in essence. It's the passing of blame. Well, it wasn't my fault. It was the woman. Oh, it wasn't my fault. It was the serpent. Serpent say, well, maybe not in that story, but you might have seen other dramatizations. The serpent say, well, I only did what they wanted. We're always passing the buck to someone else. It's not my fault. They made me do it. And again, I don't want to blame the victim. But I think in a lot of conspiracist groups and cultish groups that I've observed, there is an element of willful ignorance. There is a need to be accepted. Yesterday, there was a great presentation on Nexium and what's her name, Ms. Bronfman, where, you know, it seems that to turn against her guru, Keith Raniere, was to really abandon all of the value that he had given to her, right? It was generally accept that was for money. And what kind of a world where you say, I actually turns out I have no importance. Group, to be part of the conspiracist group, you know. In other words, the deception feels good. Why would I want to see the world through a different lens? I don't think that's rationalized, but I think it's part of what kept me for 20 years in the conspiracist fold. It helped me push blame to someone else, the CIA or who, seeing how I had some agency and I need to stop blaming others. I need to forgive. So the second sin is a very powerful part of the story. So I'm going to try to summarize Girard's theory quickly. I see that I don't have as much time as I thought I did. In 5 points, and I'm hoping I'm not bastardizing it here. A lot of it comes down to desire. Humans are political animals, as Aristotle said. We need to live in communities. Living in community, we need to learn to keep the peace. The way we often keep the peace is we follow the crowd. We do what other people seem to be doing. Fashion, rules, whatever it is, we imitate, and then we find that there's peace in imitation. We learn to desire what other people desire as well. But it's more like that proverbial MacGuffin. I don't know if you've heard the term in film studies. There's always an object in some movies, right? In Star Wars, it's the droid with the plans. In Ronin, it's the suitcase. No one knows what's inside the suitcase. Everybody wants the object because the enemy wants the object. So there's got to be something good in that. Karl Marx suggested that when there's no scarcity, everyone will be happy. Girard said that's not the way it works. We don't desire things because of the thing in itself. We desire because it's the object of someone else's desire. So there will be rivalry, there will be competition, and as soon as there's peace, there will be another object of rivalry. It's part of human nature, right? It's the original sin, if you want. The desire to achieve some sort of happiness on our own means. So we're constantly comparing ourselves to others, and desire can be positive, but can also have that negative connotation. And that leads to scandal or offense. The scandalon, it's the stone on which we trip. Is there a word for that? Une pierre d'achoppement in French. I don't have the English word. A stumbling block, thank you, a stumbling block. So taking offense is the way that we kind of protect ourselves. Our ego steps in and says that person is threatening my very safety, my way of life, my belief in truth. I mean, I'm right, like I know. Let's go in at least in what lies in front. Engage in a debate. These young people to him, you're trying to negate my right to exist. And I don't think that's his intention, but that's how it's perceived, defended. Saying, maybe I could be wrong. Where is the truth? Let's look for it together, right? The truth will set you free. But in this case, it's, I believe I've achieved the truth. I don't want to negotiate it anymore. So the person who feels scandalized is likely to scapegoat. They're going to look for they might not be completely innocent. Charge is out. It is group to band together and find peace again by saying, well, we're not them. You know, Girard uses the example of lynch mob. You know, lynch mobs were not forced to do it. The group just naturally came together of an unwanted element in their society. So I don't mean to use racial connotations here, but the idea of a lynch mob is one that that Girard uses to come together to unwanted, and that will lead ultimately to mimetic violence. There's a great essay by Girard called "The First Stone," in which he compares the story of Jesus and the woman who sinned. Interestingly, the man is not there, only the adulterous woman. And this group of men is about to stone her to death. And Jesus says, whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. And it seems the oldest man either knew they had sin, or for some other reason, they realized, yeah, they didn't have the right to do this. And one by one, they left, and then no one dared throw a stone. There was a positive mimesis, a positive imitation there, where people realized that they were the guilty party, or at least that they were not as innocent as they thought, and that the woman didn't necessarily deserve the fate that they were trying to foist on them. And he compares that to an event in Ephesus in, I think, 120 AD, where a pagan prophet, I'm trying to remember his name, Apollonius of Tyanus, who actually pushes a crowd to stone a homeless beggar in order to purge the city from some plague. And no one dares throw the first stone. So he picks up the stone and throws it, and then everybody follows. So I think the cult sometimes does this easily because the guru initiates it. There's a pressure from on high. But in conspiracism, no one needs to receive direction. It's almost pre-programmed. Someone at some point is going to make an act, a verbal act, it might be a violent act that's going to initiate the crowd, and then the whole crowd kind of goes. It's just like the dam is broken and everybody imitates them. And there's something very cathartic. There's a release of emotion. When you've identified the enemy, the CIA or whoever it is, it feels good to know that you're not part of the problem. They're the evil, and that story in your mind could allow you to persecute the other. I'm running short on time, and I obviously will not have time to go through it all. I'd be happy to discuss a number of other elements that are going to be my essay. I'm going to try to submit it to the journal. And that is to look at how conspiracism does act as a form of spirituality. The difference is that conspiracism tends to ask political questions and look for political solutions. It's really about power structures in society. Whereas I've noticed a lot of the cultish groups that I've observed, that I studied, tend to start more with a metaphysical quest. So because cults tend to focus more on some combat against, invisible entities, for example, whether it's the devil or I don't know, spirit beings or just their own selves, then there isn't necessarily that talk about bringing down the government. But for people like David Koresh, you can see that the two kind of merge seamlessly. These pictures were to show you that conspiracism is not a left-wing or a right-wing phenomenon. It tends to be across the board. Some political scientists like Joe Uzinski have been studying this empirically. And what's interesting in the United States, at least, is whoever's in the White House tends to determine what the conspiracy du jour will be afterwards. When George W. Bush was in the White House, suddenly 9/11 truthers, it was through the roof. People on the left wing were looking for a reason for why they were locked out of power. And then suddenly Barack Obama comes to power, and the truthers almost like they kind of disappear. And all of a sudden, all these birthers show up, everybody condemning Barack Obama as a secret Muslim of sorts. And so it ebbs and wanes. The one thing that Uzinski couldn't answer for me, though, and I asked him on my podcast, is why in the age of Trump do you give a certain group of people power and they're still paranoid? They're still, using these conspiracy theories. So there's something in populism that doesn't necessarily fit the mold of what the political scientists are showing. I think that a lot of good research has been done there, but the reason I like Girard and I take this more kind of existentialist approach is I think we're all looking for a story that'll make us kind of the hero in our own lives. That'll give us the moral high ground. And conspiracism really helps us to be able to do that. Okay, so there's only a few minutes left. There's a lot that I could say. Let me just briefly summarize. I was going to talk a bit about how George Orwell's 2 Minutes Hate gives us a very good example of conspiracism. And my main point here was that in the novel, people are not forced to take part of the 2 Minutes Hate. It is actually, it's an organized ritual, but people look forward to it. They want it. There's a cathartic element to hating, to screaming, to pointing the finger at Emmanuel Goldstein. Is it because he's Jewish? Is it because he's advocating liberal values? It seems to be mixing Marxist and fascist elements here, it's really hard to gauge whether this crowd is animated by a left or a visceral need for an enemy and the comfort of some sort of ideology or a big brother, a guru of some sort to tell them that everything is under control and the world, there's no gray area. I was going to talk a little bit about the similarities between conspiracism and cultishness and spirituality in general. I think a lot of people here might already be aware of some of these things. I'd be happy to talk about it at another time. So let me end by defining conspiracism clearly, because it's easy, for example, to use a word like cult. And it becomes so generalized, or it's used to say, these are the people who don't believe what I believe, that the word gets bandied around to the point that many people say, it doesn't mean anything, let's not use it. Many academics don't like the word cult because they say it's pejorative. I think if we talk about cultishness as a methodology rather than a certain set of beliefs, like Daniel Shaw talked about the traumatizing narcissist, right? You don't need to be a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or a Buddhist or an atheist. A traumatizing narcissist is the same across the board. So if we look more at the methodology, the structure of the group, then we can deal with objective categories. So a conspiracy theory, as philosopher Kasim Kassam defines it, is a set of beliefs, first of all, that's very speculative. It's based on a lot of questions, trying to connect things without evidence. It's a set of belief that is, at its essence, at its core, designed to be a counter narrative. It's contrarian because there's always some official story out there, and the conspiracist group is trying to offer a counterbalancing narrative. The narrative changes all the time. Because, and I've noticed this with the Kennedy assassination, it doesn't matter whether the bullet was zigzag or not, as long as the Warren Commission was wrong. So what matters in the conspiracy theory is not that they know the truth, because the truth is going to change every day. It's the fact that they're not part of the official story. It's more of an anti-faith, if you wish, than a specific faith with a dogma that's set. They're esoteric because they often offer explanations that require either pseudoscience, pseudo-history, mystic energy, mind control, very science fiction-y type of explanations. They're amateurish in the sense that most conspiracy theories and theorists are not experts in their domain. They might have a PhD, but it turns out their PhD, say, is in religious studies, and they're arguing about the temperature at which steel melts, in the World Trade Center buildings. And finally, they're pre-modern. I don't like that term as much as deterministic. They tend to believe that all of history is guided by an invisible hand. And therefore, there is no room for chance. There's no room for chaos. There's no room for free agency. Everything seems to be part of some grand evil scheme to control the world. And coming from an evangelical background, it took me about 4 decades to realize that most evangelical Christians I know think the devil is so much more powerful than their God. If they have a God who created the world and is forgiving, why do they keep thinking they need to, be, what do you call it, set up these barricades, whether they're figurative or visual or physical, against the enemy, right? In fighting abortion or things like that. At some point, you got to believe that your God is more powerful than the evil. But conspiracism kind of gives up to despair. It is a religion of despair, I believe. And leaving that allowed me to, I think, to find both a deeper faith and something more meaningful. All right, I'm going to end there. I apologize. I had much more than I wanted. If there are any questions, stick around, because I know there are other sessions to go on. And thank you for your time.